Hello and welcome to Decolonising the Body, the 2021 Decolonial Summer School Programme. So what do we mean by the decolonial? How does it relate to the histories of colonisation? What is the difference between the decolonial and the post-colonial? And why is it maybe an important thing for us to be talking about at this moment? What I'm going to do in this little recording is give you an introduction to some of the ways in which I think about the decolonial. But most important, perhaps, is to say that the decolonial is the project to come. It's the blank space. It's not something that is already established. It's something that we are in the process of creating, all of us together. And so this is some preliminary ideas, but it's really up to you to think about what the decolonial means to you, both in terms of how that makes us think about the past, what it means to us in the present, and what it means in terms of thinking about the kind of future world that we would like to see, that we think is possible. So maybe a place to start is to say that the decolonial is, of course, in conversation with colonialism and colonization. However, it's really important to distinguish between colonialism as a particular set of people, namely white Europeans, and their processes of going and conquering and taking land and exploiting and enslaving and killing. These particular physical forms of colonialism are, of course, part of the history and need to be addressed. But in many ways, for decolonial thinkers, they're the easiest part of the story. They're the things that we can see really clearly and have been addressed in lots of parts of the world through uprisings, rebellions, decolonization processes. However, what for decolonial thinkers is perhaps the more important question is the systems of knowledge, the processes of regulation and governance that emerge from that particular period that shaped our experiences of ourselves, of our societies, our politics, our relationships to each other at the time of colonization, but that also continue to shape us in the present day. And so this is where I think the influence of Foucault and Foucault's idea of power becomes really clear. So as we've spoken about in earlier sessions, the idea of power from Foucault is that it's not something that is imposed from top down onto passive bodies, not in the modern era at least. And rather it is something that circulates amongst us, that we are all producing and reproducing constantly, either in resistant ways or in compliant ways, but it's something that involves all of us. And so I think for us to use that conception of power helps us to think about and understand why colonization is not just something that a group of Europeans did to the rest of us as passive objects, but rather a system of knowledges and ideas that circulated and dominated other ideas and other systems of knowledge and became internalized and are reproduced constantly by all of us. And so we are active agents in this. So this poses a very different set of questions, because it's not just about removing a particular group of people or even a particular system of government, but it's about going back to some of these practices of knowing, some of the truths with which we are operating. So one way in which decolonial thinkers have urged us to think about this is the idea of mastery. So what we see throughout the colonial period is various discourses of mastery, whether it's mastery of humans over other humans, whether it's mastery of humans over animals, over the environment, the land. All of these processes of creating categories and classifications and then establishing hierarchies based on those. These discourses of mastery have circulated and taken hold in ways that have been really problematic, but also very difficult for us to shift. And so the decolonial project is about how do we recognize the mastery narrative as being limited? How do we try and remember all of the other knowledges, the other ways in which we experience our relationship to each other, to the natural environment, to other species? How do we remember those other forms of knowledge that have not completely been erased, but that have been systematically pushed out, excluded, marginalized in order to create a space for this dominant knowledge? So this, I think, is part of the project to try and access other knowledge systems. But I think we also have to be careful in that process. That's not just about saying we reject these ideas of Western modernity in favor of some other indigenous tradition of knowledge, our own indigenous traditions of knowledge. Because quite often those indigenous traditions of knowledge that we then go back to draw on are themselves also implicated in these relations of power, and also are often employing very similar logics. We should really think about, why is it certain systems of non-Western traditional knowledge or social organization have continued and indeed flourished even with all of the violence of colonialism? Is it really because they are so resistant to the imposed ideas of Western Europe? Or is it because actually they ultimately adopt the same logic? They actually are useful to promoting particular colonial ideals, or at least they certainly are not damaging of the status quo that creates these hierarchies. And so, I mean, one example of that might be to think about how, as an Indian, I don't want to embrace a particular version of Indianness as a response to British imperialism that doesn't recognize that the caste system has, as much as any other system, a logic of domination and hierarchization that is extremely problematic, and that certainly to me is not a decolonial approach to the world. I also think it's important to recognize that when we're talking about understanding these other knowledges, freeing ourselves from only viewing ourselves through the lens of dominant analytical frames, such as, Western ideas of class, gender, race, that in that process, it's not just about us turning in and only looking at ourselves in our particularity. The idea that of the decolonial is also that this is a planetary project. And I think the Cameroonian thinker Achille Mbembe put this most beautifully when he said that colonialism was a project of planetary control. So the response to that cannot be to withdraw from the rest of the planet and to then turn into our particular corners. Whether we like it or not, whether we see it or not, we are all interconnected. I mean, the current COVID-19 global pandemic demonstrates this to us in really physical ways. We are all interconnected. Anyone who has been a migrant, even just for a short period of time, knows that we are interconnected. And there are very few of us now who can say that we and every single member of our family has only ever lived in the one place, in the one community, and never had to move or be in a place where they are not the majority or don't belong at some stage in their lives. So these processes also demonstrate interconnection. Even those of us who maybe are living in the same place that we have always lived, where our ancestors have always lived, if we are participating in any sort of economic activity, we are part of a global economic system. We are part of the capitalist world order. Any of us who are citizens of a nation state are part of an interconnected system. So there's been an argument made in the past that ideas of cosmopolitanism and even the idea of sort of universal humanity, that these are very elitist ideas. What I would suggest is that the reality of the interconnectedness or the common experience of humanity is not the elitist part. The elitist part is who has had the access to seeing those connections, Who has had the ability to study the connections between African tribes in sub-Saharan Africa and the practices of people living in Samoa? Or who has thought about European feudal structures and plantation sectors in the Caribbean? That traditionally these connections have only been seen by people in very particular locations, elite parts of the world. And this is not just about white people or Westerners. It's about a particular global class, those of us who have been able to access those centers of power that allow us to have some sort of sense of what the world looks like. Whereas for other people, even though they are interconnected, whether it's through a particular education system or other ways in which people have been deprived of the right, the ability to see themselves in connections with others. So for me, a big part of the Decolonial project is to not only to look at ourselves and our own traditions, but also to be interested and to reach out to other traditions and other parts of the world, and particularly those that are not just Western Europe, but not necessarily exclusive of Europe, to say that we are connected and there is something to be learned from all these different parts. And the other thing that I think is important in that process is to say this is not just about describing different experiences. So it's also about a process of freeing up who gets to theorize those experiences. So there is a famous essay by the subaltern studies scholar Gayatri Spivak called Can the Subaltern Speak? And I'll do a separate recording on that at another point. In that essay, Spivak talks about the idea of the subaltern as that person whose voice can never properly be heard. Sometimes that's been taken very literally to say there are people whose voices are just not heard at all in the world. It may well be true that some people's stories are still not heard, but actually I think the problem is slightly different to that. And I think actually Spivak was pointing to something different to that. Rather, I think it's been put very, very neatly, if rather sarcastically, by the Bosnian feminist scholar Jasmina Husanovic, who was asked in the context of Bosnia, can the Bosnian think? And what she means by that is that while Bosnia has been the source of incredible amounts of research, and Bosnians have spoken a lot about their experience, they've told their stories, what has not been allowed to happen, according to Jasmina Husanovic, is Bosnians theorizing that experience. Rather, they provide the raw material, the story, that then is taken and theorized back in the centers of power. It turns into an academic textbook produced in London or in New York. But the theories are not theories that emerge from Bosnians in their own context. So that's where I would encourage us to think about not just sharing our experiences, but going the next step of thinking, how do we theorize our experiences? That we don't need to only tell the stories that allow other people to theorize us. We have the capacity to think for ourselves and to theorize for ourselves. And not only will that be enriching for us, I think it will be enriching for global knowledge. So for me, that is another important part of the Decolonial project. And that is a large part of why I'm so excited for us to set up this Decolonial Summer School, to use Sri Lanka as the starting point for thinking, not just about what happens in Sri Lanka, but to speak back to what happens in the world. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to talk about gender inequality or racial inequality? Not just in Sri Lanka, but at a global level, and not in a way that imposes this set of ideas on top of anyone else's ideas, but rather is a dialogue with all the different ideas in this world. And so maybe this is the last point I'll make about what I think the decolonial involves. And that is to say that in the process of theorizing, this is also about recognizing that theorizing doesn't necessarily require us to have one meta-narrative, so one truth, one set of analytical frames that then needs to apply to everywhere. That's been part of the problem of the theories of mastery, and we don't change anything if we just replace the existing frames of knowledge that emerge as a result of the colonial era and the particular ideas about truth and mastery from that time, with a new imposed global frame. Rather, it requires us to recognize that global knowledge is always going to be a process of dialogue. It's going to be about different ontologies. So, ontologies meaning theories of being. And it's going to be different epistemologies. So, ideas of how knowledge is produced. And what is interesting and important in that process is the conversation that happens, where we can identify what are our commonalities, where are our points of connection, and what are our specificities and our differences, and how do we still find ways to talk to each other across those differences.